To the men in the room, Choi Hyun-Soo was having dinner. To Joleen J, Butler, he was having his last meal. The plate was set. The trap was sprung. The toxin was already reacting with the air. In the world of the Korean Mafia, touching the boss's plate is a death sentence, but Joleen knew that letting him take a bite would start a war that would burn the city down. The fork was an inch from his lips when she broke the silence. The dish looked impeccable, a masterpiece of marbleized beef and gold leaf garnish, prepared by a personal chef whose hands never shook. But Joleen saw what the armed enforcers missed. She didn't see a meal. She saw a chemical reaction. A faint, unnatural green glow was bleeding into the steam, a shimmer that didn't belong on anything meant for a human to consume. She wasn't a hero, and she wasn't a soldier. She was a waitress who had spent years being invisible, mastering the art of noticing the things the powerful are too arrogant to see. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lunged toward the sacred circle of the table. She had 1 second to swap the plate, or a lifetime to regret the bullet that would follow. The shift always began with a ritual of erasure. Joleen stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the employee locker room, tucking every stray curl of her hair into a tight, severe bun and smoothing the creases of her white apron until it looked like a sheet of unblemished paper. In this lounge, the staff was designed to be part of the architecture, functional, elegant, and entirely mute. To the men who frequented the Golden Dragon, Joleen wasn't a woman named Joleen J, Butler. She was a pair of hands that refilled crystal tumblers and a shadow that cleared away the remnants of deals made in whispers. But Joleen had a secret. While they were busy ignoring her, she was busy memorizing them. She stepped out onto the floor, the heavy scent of expensive sandalwood and aged cognac settling over her like a second skin. The room was a fortress of mahogany and shadows, lit by low-hanging amber lamps that made the ice in the glasses glitter like raw diamonds. Joleen moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the hand-woven rugs. Her first task was the perimeter tables, where the mid-level associates sat, men who wore their power like ill-fitting suits, loud and performative. She moved among them, her eyes downcast, but her mind wide open. She didn't need to look at their faces to know who they were. She read the room through the debris they left behind. At table 4, the underboss was agitated. He had shredded his linen napkin into a pile of white lint, a nervous tick that suggested a shipment was late or a wife was suspicious. At table 2, a rival negotiator was lying. His voice was steady, but his left heel was drumming a frantic, silent beat against the floor molding. Joleen refilled their water, adjusted their silverware, and moved on, a ghost passing through a world of monsters. This was the art of watching. To the world, Joleen was at the bottom of the social food chain, a girl working double shifts to keep a roof over her head, but in her mind, she was a cartographer of human weakness. She noticed the way a bodyguard's hand lingered a fraction of a second too long near his holster when a certain door opened. She noticed which untraceable phones were placed face down on the silk tablecloths. She noticed the sweat on a waiter's upper lip that had nothing to do with the heat of the kitchen. As the night deepened, the atmosphere in the lounge shifted, the air growing thick with a sudden, suffocating gravity. The invisible status Joleen held was her greatest asset, but tonight, it felt like a heavy shroud. She stood near the service station, her back straight, her expression a mask of polite neutrality. She watched the head server, a man named Marcus who had been there for 10 years, adjust his tie for the 5th time in 3 minutes. Marcus was a professional, a man of iron nerves, but his fingers were trembling. Joleen's gaze drifted to the kitchen doors. Usually, the scent of the signature dish, the Korean pear-marinated wagyu, was sweet and earthy, a rich aroma that signaled the peak of the evening. But tonight, as the heavy oak doors swung open for a brief second, a different scent caught the edge of her senses. It was sharp, metallic, almost like the smell of a thunderstorm just before the lightning strikes. It was a scent that didn't belong in a five-star kitchen. It was the scent of a mistake, or perhaps something far more deliberate. She looked toward the center of the room, where the great table sat empty, waiting for its master. The guards were already taking their positions, their faces masks of stone, their posture rigid. They were looking for threats they could shoot. They were looking for men with grudges and pockets with bulges. They weren't looking at the steam rising from the plates. They weren't looking at the way the light refracted off the fine porcelain. They were too high up to look down at the details. Joleen, positioned at the very bottom, saw everything. She saw the hierarchy of the room not as a ladder of power, but as a web of vulnerabilities, and tonight, she could feel the center of the web beginning to fray. The heavy oak doors didn't just open. They seemed to retreat, yielding to a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure that signaled the arrival of Choi Hyun-Soo. The lounge, which had been a low hum of hushed deals and clinking crystal, fell into a vacuum of absolute silence. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the air inside a tomb. Hyun-Soo walked with a measured, predatory cadence, his tailored black suit absorbing the amber light of the room. He didn't look at his associates, and he certainly didn't look at the staff. He was a man who moved as though the world was merely a backdrop for his intentions. Joleen stood at her station, her hands clasped behind her back, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. From her vantage point, she saw the choreography of power in its purest form. The enforcers fanned out, their movements synchronized and clinical, creating a human perimeter around the center table. They were disciplined men, alert and stone-faced, their eyes scanning the room with the mechanical precision of security cameras. They looked for the obvious, the twitch of a hand toward a jacket, the nervous glance of a busboy, the unvetted guest. They were looking for enemies with faces, not enemies in a sauce. Hyun-Soo took his seat, his posture perfectly upright, his expression unreadable as a slab of granite. He was the sun around which this dark galaxy orbited, radiating a quiet authority that demanded total deference. As he settled in, the service began. This was the moment of peak tension for the staff, a high-wire act where a single drop spoon could result in a permanent dismissal. Marcus, the head server, led the procession from the kitchen, his face a pale mask of concentration. As the kitchen door swung open, the scent Joleen had noticed earlier, that sharp, ozone-like metallic tang, returned, stronger now. It cut through the expensive perfume and tobacco smoke of the room like a razor blade. Most would have mistaken it for the zest of an exotic spice or the sear of the high-heat pans, but Joleen's senses were tuned to a different frequency. She watched the primary plate as it was carried toward Hyun-Soo. It was a masterpiece of culinary architecture. The Wagyu beef was glistening, nestled against a vibrant bed of microgreens and a reduction that should have been a deep, earthy burgundy. But as the plate passed through a shaft of overhead LED light, Joleen's heart did a slow, sickening roll in her chest. At a distance, the dish looked flawless. But as Marcus lowered it toward the mahogany table, Joleen saw the glow. It wasn't a glow of freshness or heat. It was a faint, unnatural shimmer, a neon green iridescence that clung to the edges of the pear-based garnish. It looked like the oily film on a rain-slicked parking lot, a chemical rainbow that only appeared when the light hit it at a specific angle. Her mind raced through a mental catalog of everything she knew about the ingredients in the Golden Dragon's kitchen. There was no salt, no oil, and no reduction in their repertoire that produced a phosphorescent reaction. She stared, her pupils dilating as she focused on the rising steam. Real food steam rises in soft, dissipating clouds. This steam was different. It was thin, almost oily, and it didn't dissipate. It lingered in a tight, swirling coil above the meat. To anyone else, it was just the heat of a fresh meal. To Joleen, it was a physical manifestation of a death warrant. She realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that she wasn't looking at a culinary error. She was looking at a chemical reaction. Someone had introduced a reactive agent, likely a tasteless, odorless toxin that was currently bonding with the acidity of the pear garnish, creating that subtle, telltale shimmer. She looked at the guards. They were focused on the room's perimeter. She looked at Hyun-Soo. He was reaching for his linen napkin, oblivious to the venom sitting 6 inches from his hand. The chef who had prepared this was a man who prided himself on perfection. There was no way this shimmer was an accident. It was a signature. A hit. The room felt like it was beginning to tilt. Joleen's invisible status, the very thing she had cultivated to survive, now felt like a cage. If she stayed silent, she was an accomplice to a murder that would ignite a gang war and likely result in the execution of every staff member in the building. If she moved, she was a waitress breaking the most sacred rule of the underworld. Never touch the boss's plate. Her hands began to shake, and for the first time in 3 years, the mask of the perfect servant cracked. She saw the fork in Hyun-Soo's hand. She saw the green tint deepening as the meat cooled. She had 3 seconds to decide if she was a shadow or a human being. The silence of the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic, metallic click of a lighter from a nearby table. Choi Hyun-Soo did not eat like a man in a hurry. He ate like a judge delivering a sentence. He adjusted his cufflink, the diamond catching the low light, and then his hand moved toward the silver fork resting beside the shimmering steak. Joleen's world narrowed down to that single point of contact. The green iridescence on the plate seemed to pulse now, a silent siren that only she could hear. She was exactly 6 steps away. To the enforcers, those 6 steps were a demilitarized zone. No server crossed into the boss's personal space unless invited, and certainly not with the frantic, predatory energy that was currently surging through Joleen's veins. Her lungs felt tight, her ribcage a cage of bone for a heart that was trying to beat its way out of her chest. She saw Hyun-Soo's fingers close around the silver handle. She saw the tines of the fork descend, hovering just millimeters above the meat, ready to pierce the expensive, poison flesh.
Go.
The word didn't come from her mind. It came from her marrow. Joleen broke the formation. She didn't glide. She lunged. The grace of a professional server vanished, replaced by the desperate, raw utility of a woman trying to stop a train wreck. The polished floorboards, usually her silent allies, shrieked under the sudden friction of her heels. In the time it took for Hyun-Soo to blink, Joleen was there. Her left hand shot out, her fingers gripping the edge of the poisoned porcelain. Her right hand, carrying a fresh, untouched plate of the same dish she had snatched from a passing runner's tray a second prior, moved in a blurring arc. It was a chaotic, violent sleight of hand. The poisoned plate was yanked away, the porcelain clattering against her palm with a sharp, dissonant ring that sounded like a gunshot in the hushed room. The swap was completed just as the tines of Hyun-Soo's fork made contact with the ceramic of the new plate. For a heartbeat, time froze. The entire room became a tableau of frozen violence. Joleen stood hunched over the table, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and glassy with terror, clutching the neon plate to her chest like a shield. Choi Hyun-Soo remained perfectly still, his fork pressed against the replacement steak, his cold, obsidian eyes slowly traveling upward to meet hers. It was the first time he had ever looked at her, and the weight of his gaze felt like a physical blow. Then, the vacuum of silence shattered. The sound of 20 chairs screeching back against the floor was deafening. The enforcers, moved by a singular, lethal instinct, swarmed. The air was suddenly filled with the terrifying, rhythmic clack-clack of slides being racked and safeties being flicked off. Joleen found herself at the center of a circle of steel. 3 gun barrels were pressed into the back of her skull. Another was leveled at her throat. The men who had been statues seconds ago were now screaming, their voices a jagged blur of Korean and English commands. Don't move. Hands up. Drop it now. The head of security, a man with a jagged scar across his temple and eyes that promised a slow death, stepped forward, his pistol pressed so hard into Joleen's temple that she could feel the cold circular rim of the muzzle bruising her skin. "You just committed suicide, girl," he hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Joleen didn't drop the plate. Her fingers were locked in a spasm of rigor mortis around the rim of the poisoned dish. She looked down at the table, where the safe steak sat innocently beneath Hyun-Soo's fork, and then back at the man who held her life in his hands. The chaos was swirling around them, shouting associates, the crash of falling glassware, the frantic movement of guards securing the exits, but at the center of the storm, Hyun-Soo remained eerily calm. He hadn't moved a muscle. He didn't look afraid. He looked insulted. "Explain," Hyun-Soo said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the shouting of his men like a blade through silk. The room fell into a sudden, jagged quiet. The guards didn't lower their weapons, but they held their breath. Joleen's voice was a thin, trembling wire. She looked at the plate in her hands, the one with a faint, fading green shimmer, and then at the man who was one finger twitch away from ending her. "It wasn't a mistake, Mr. Choi," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "I didn't break the rules to disrespect you. I broke them because the person who cooked this doesn't want you to see tomorrow." The muzzle pressed harder against her head. The stakes had moved beyond a simple service error. She had just accused the inner sanctum of treason, and in this world, if you couldn't prove a lie, you became the sacrifice. The pressure of the handgun against Joleen's temple was so intense she could hear the metallic hum of the weapon vibrating against her skull. Her vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing down to the sharp, clinical smell of gun oil and the heavy, expensive scent of Choi Hyun-Soo's cologne. The enforcers were a wall of dark wool and bared teeth, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the mahogany table. One word from the man in the center, and Joleen's life would end as a messy footnote on a Persian rug. "Sir, let me take her to the back," the head of security growled, his voice thick with a desire for retribution. She touched the plate. She broke the circle. "It's an assassination attempt." Hyun-Soo didn't answer immediately. He remained carved from stone, his dark eyes tracing the frantic rise and fall of Joleen's chest. He looked at the plate she held, clutched against her apron like a holy relic, and then at the replacement dish she had slid onto the table. There was no fear in his expression, only a terrifying, deep-seated curiosity. To him, Joleen was an anomaly, a glitch in a perfectly calibrated machine. "Wait," Hyun-Soo said. It was a soft command, but the effect was instantaneous. The tension in the room didn't dissipate. It coiled tighter, like a spring compressed to its breaking point. The guards didn't holster their weapons, but the pressure on Joleen's temple eased by a fraction of a millimeter. Hyun-Soo leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking softly. He checked his watch, a silver masterpiece that cost more than Joleen would earn in a decade. "The world is built on protocols," he said, his voice smooth and cold as ice over a deep lake. "Protocol says you're already dead. You have violated my space, interrupted my meal, and caused a disturbance in my house. In my world, there are no accidents, only intentions." He looked up at her, his gaze piercing through her fear. "You have 60 seconds to convince me that your intention was something other than treason. If the clock runs out and I am not satisfied, they will not even find your shadow." Joleen's throat felt as though it were filled with broken glass. Her 60 seconds began with the heavy silence of the room, the eyes of the underworld's most dangerous men boring into her. She looked down at the plate in her hands. The green shimmer was beginning to fade as the food cooled, the chemical reaction slowing down. She knew that if she didn't speak now, the evidence would disappear before her eyes. "The steam," Joleen whispered, her voice cracking before she found a thread of steel in it. "Look at the steam, Mr. Choi." 5 seconds, he noted, his eyes fixed on her. "I have served you for 3 years, she said, her words coming faster now, fueled by the desperate clarity of the dying. I know how the Wagyu is supposed to smell. I know how the pear reduction is supposed to glaze. The chef uses a specific sea salt from the Sinan Islands. It's pure. It's white. But the plate I took from you, the salt was reacting with something else. There is a shimmer in the air above that meat that isn't heat. It's a phosphorescent byproduct of a phosphorus-based toxin. It reacts with the acidity of the pear garnish. If you eat that, your heart stops within 2 minutes.
No struggle, no scream.
Just a natural failure. 30 seconds, Hyun-Soo said, his face unreadable. I'm not a plant, Joleen continued, her hands shaking so violently the porcelain rattled. I'm a waitress. I've spent every night for 1,000 days watching you and your men. I see the things you're too powerful to notice. I see the way the kitchen staff changes when a certain associate enters the back. I saw the head chef's hands shaking when he plated this. He didn't make a mistake. He made a choice. He's been in that kitchen for 10 years, and today was the first time he didn't taste his own sauce before it left the line. The guard shifted, casting suspicious glances toward the kitchen doors. Joleen could feel the air in the room changing. She wasn't just a girl in a uniform anymore. She was a witness. 45 seconds, Hyun-Soo murmured. He leaned forward, picking up a silver spoon and turning it over in his hand, watching his own reflection. You are claiming my kitchen has been breached. You are claiming my most loyal servant is a murderer. Those are heavy words for someone who carries a tray. I am claiming that everyone in this room is looking at you, Joleen said, her voice finally steady, but I am the only one looking at your plate. If I wanted you dead, I would have stayed in the shadows and let you take the bite. I didn't risk a bullet to be a traitor. I risked it because I'm the only one here who actually saw the threat. Hyun-Soo looked at his watch one last time. The 60 seconds had passed. The head of security tightened his grip on his weapon, waiting for the signal to pull the trigger. The silence stretched, long and agonizing, as Hyun-Soo stared at the shimmering, cooling meat on the plate Joleen held. The clock has stopped, Hyun-Soo said. He looked at the head of security and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The guns didn't lower, but the immediate threat of death retreated into a simmer. He turned his attention back to Joleen. You have a sharp eye, Joleen J. Butler. Let's see if the rest of the world is as honest as your fear. The silence that followed Hyun-Soo's command was more terrifying than the shouting had been. It was a cold, clinical silence, the kind that exists in a laboratory or an execution chamber. Joleen felt the sweat trickling down the back of her neck, her uniform collar suddenly feeling like a noose. The enforcers hadn't moved. They were a ring of predatory statues, their eyes darting between the boss and the woman holding the evidence of their failure. Hyun-Soo gestured vaguely with a hand adorned by a heavy signet ring. The chemistry, he prompted, his voice a low, dangerous purr. Explain it to me like I am a man who appreciates the details of his own demise. Joleen took a shallow breath, her fingers still locked around the rim of the suspicious plate. She didn't look at the guns. She looked at the food. It starts with the salt, Mr. Choi, she began, her voice gaining a rhythmic, academic clarity that surprised even her. You insist on Sinan sea salt. It's rich in magnesium and calcium, which gives it a specific crystalline structure. But more importantly, it's alkaline. The signature dish tonight is glazed with a pear and balsamic reduction. That's highly acidic. She tilted the plate slightly so the overhead light caught the edge of the meat. Usually, when the salt hits the reduction, it dissolves cleanly. It enhances the flavor. But look at the grain here. She pointed a trembling finger at a small cluster of white crystals that hadn't quite melted into the sauce. Those aren't salt crystals. They're too uniform, too jagged. Someone has cut the sea salt with a powdered organophosphate, likely a pesticide derivative or a synthetic nerve agent designed for high-end assassinations. A ripple of unease moved through the guards. They knew guns. They didn't know molecular structures. Joleen continued, her mind racing through the fragments of chemistry she had studied before she had to drop out of college to support her family. The toxin is stable on its own. It's odorless and tasteless. But when it's introduced to a warm, acidic environment, like your pear glaze, it begins to oxidize. That's where the glow comes from. She leaned in closer, the proximity to the boss a dangerous gamble, but she needed him to see. The green shimmer isn't a spice. It's the visual byproduct of the phosphate bonding with the acetic acid in the glaze. It creates a temporary bioluminescence. In a dimly lit room, most people would think it's just the reflection of the decor or a trick of the steam. But the steam is the second giveaway. She gestured to the thin, oily vapor still curling sluggishly from the meat. Water vapor dissipates. But this vapor is heavy. It's carrying the weight of the chemical reaction. If you leaned in to smell this dish, Mr. Choi, you wouldn't smell pear. You would smell a faint, sweet almond scent, the smell of the toxin beginning to aerosolize. By the time the first piece reached your tongue, your respiratory system would have already started to shut down. Hyun-Soo's gaze was fixed on the plate, his eyes narrowed as if he were trying to see the molecules dancing in the sauce. He was a man who lived by his instincts, but he was also a man who respected expertise. "And the chef?" he asked. "A man who has cooked for me for a decade would know this." "He would," Joleen agreed, her heart hammering. "And that is why he didn't taste it. I watched him through the service window. Every night, Chef Park tastes the reduction on a silver spoon before it's plated. It's his ritual. But tonight, he didn't touch it. He plated it with his back to the cameras, his movements too fast, too frantic. He didn't want the vapor near his own face. He knew that even the steam was a delivery system." She looked up, meeting Hyun-Soo's unreadable eyes. "The chemistry doesn't lie, Mr. Choi. People can be bought. Loyalty can be traded. But a phosphorus reaction in an acidic glaze is a mathematical certainty. Someone in your kitchen didn't just try to kill you. They tried to make it look like a heart attack, hidden behind the elegance of your favorite meal." The air in the VIP suite felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. Joleen had moved beyond the role of a waitress. She was now the architect of a revelation that threatened the very foundations of Hyun-Soo's security. She had provided the science, the logic, and the motive. Now, she waited to see if the boss would trust the girl who cleared his tables over the men who guarded his life. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen didn't swing open this time. They were kicked wide, the sound echoing like a percussion of doom against the marble floors. Two of Hyun-Soo's enforcers emerged, dragging a man between them whose white culinary tunic was a stark, jarring contrast to the dark suits of the Mafia. Chef Park, a man who had commanded the Golden Dragon's kitchen with the iron fist of a general for over 10 years, looked suddenly diminished, his stature shrinking under the oppressive weight of the room's silence. They threw him onto the rug a few feet from the boss's table. Park scrambled to his knees, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. The air around him seemed to thicken with the scent of old grease and fresh, cold sweat. Hyun-Soo didn't move. He didn't even look down at the man who had fed him thousands of meals. He kept his eyes on Joleen, a silent command for her to finish what she had started. "Chef Park," Joleen said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the gun still hovering in her peripheral vision. "Tell the boss why you didn't taste the reduction tonight." Park's head snapped up, his eyes bloodshot and darting wildly. "She's lying. This girl, this servant. She's trying to hide her own mistake. I've served the chairman for a decade. Why would I risk everything now?" His voice was high-pitched, a frantic vibrato that lacked the resonance of an innocent man. Joleen stepped forward, not toward the chef, but toward the plate she had set aside. She looked at Park, not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of an observer. "Look at his hands, Mr. Choi," she whispered. Every eye in the room shifted. Park tried to clench his fists, tried to hide them in the folds of his white apron, but it was too late. His fingers were twitching with a fine, rhythmic tremor. It wasn't the shaking of a man who was afraid. It was something neurological, a localized spasm. That's the first sign of exposure, Joleen explained, her eyes fixed on the chef's cuticles. The toxin is a dermal irritant before it's a lethal ingestible. You weren't wearing gloves when you handled the salt. Were you, chef? You were in a hurry. You thought a quick wash would be enough. But phosphorus-based agents bind to the oils in the skin. Look at the tips of his fingers. They're flush, a deep, unnatural crimson. Park pulled his hands back as if they were on fire, his face draining of what little color remained. I burned them on the stove. It was a busy service. You didn't burn them, Joleen countered, her voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. And you didn't just forget the ritual. Look at his collar, Mr. Choi. He isn't sweating because of the kitchen's heat. He's sweating in a specific pattern. Hyperhidrosis of the forehead and upper lip, while his neck remains dry. That is a textbook symptom of mild anticholinesterase poisoning. He breathed in the vapor while he was plating your meal. He's currently suffering from the very thing he tried to feed you. The chef's breathing turned into a wheeze. He looked at Hyun-Soo, his mouth working but no sound coming out. The physical tells were undeniable now. The pinpoint pupils, the frantic swallowing, the way his skin seemed to be turning a translucent, sickly gray under the VIP lounge's amber lights. Joleen walked closer to the kneeling man, her shadow falling over him. Who paid you, chef? Or was it a threat? Because the man I saw yesterday wouldn't have missed the shimmer on that plate. But the man I see today, he didn't even dare to look at the dish once it left his station. You didn't just stop being a chef tonight. You stopped being a survivor. Park collapsed further into himself, his forehead touching the expensive rug. A single, heavy drop of sweat fell from his brow, hitting the floor with a sound that felt as loud as a gavel. The betrayal was no longer a theory. It was written in the tremors of his hands and the panic in his lungs. Joleen stood back, returning to the edge of the light, her role as the observer complete. She had peeled back the layers of a decade of loyalty to reveal the rot underneath, using nothing but the things she had seen from the corners of the room. Hyun-Soo finally turned his gaze toward the chef. The look wasn't one of anger, it was something far worse. It was total, chilling indifference. The man who had been a pillar of his household was now nothing more than a broken piece of equipment to be discarded. Take him, Hyun-Soo said, his voice a soft, final exhale. But don't kill him yet. I want to know who provided the salt. As the enforcers dragged the sobbing, twitching chef away, the room settled into a new kind of tension. The threat was identified, but not yet neutralized. Joleen felt the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, hollow realization. She had survived the chef, but she was still standing in a room full of wolves, and she was the only one who knew how the next trap was set. The departure of Chef Park left a vacuum of sound that was quickly filled by the rhythmic tapping of Choi Hyun-Soo's fingers against the mahogany table. The immediate threat had been hauled away in a heap of white linen and terror, but the air remained electrified. The guards had lowered their weapons slightly, but their eyes remained fixed on Joleen. In the world of the Korean Mafia, evidence was not merely spoken, it had to be undeniable. Logic was a luxury, but proof was a requirement. Hyun-Soo's gaze drifted from the door back to the plate Joleen still held with white-knuckled intensity. You speak of molecules and tremors, Joleen J, Butler, he said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. But I am not a scientist. I am a man who deals in certainties. You have dismantled my kitchen and shamed my security, but all I see is a girl holding a piece of expensive beef and a collection of clever words. If I am to turn my world upside down based on your observations, I need more than a lecture. I need a sign. The head of security stepped closer, his shadow looming over Joleen. If there's no poison, she's just a waitress who hallucinated a ghost to feel important. And for that, we'll give her a real ghost to talk to. Joleen felt the cold sweat on her own palms. She knew that the chemical shimmer was fading as the temperature of the meat dropped. If she didn't act now, the toxin would stabilize and become invisible to the naked eye, leaving her standing there with a perfectly normal-looking steak and a death warrant. She scanned the table, her mind working with the frantic precision of a machine under stress. Her eyes landed on a small, crystal bowl of lemon wedges, intended for the seafood course that was never served. "I need a lemon," she said, her voice small but firm. Hyun-Soo raised an eyebrow, a gesture that was almost a dare. He signaled with a flick of his wrist. One of the guards grabbed the bowl and shoved it toward her. Joleen took a single wedge, the rind cool and waxy against her trembling fingers. "The toxin is an organophosphate," she explained, her voice gaining strength as she focused on the task. "It is engineered to stay dormant in an alkaline or neutral state to avoid detection by the tongue. But phosphorus compounds have a violent, unstable reaction to high citric acidity when they are already bonded to proteins, like this meat. If this were just salt and pear juice, the lemon would do nothing but change the flavor." She stepped closer to the table, the guards tensing as she entered the boss's immediate radius. She held the lemon wedge over the center of the steak, where the salt crystals had been most concentrated. The room held its breath. Even the men at the peripheral tables stood up, straining to see the center of the room. Joleen squeezed. A single, clear drop of lemon juice fell through the air, hitting the surface of the wagyu with a soft, wet sound. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the reaction began. The spot where the juice touched the meat didn't just sizzle, it hissed. A tiny plume of foul-smelling, yellow-gray smoke curled upward, and the vibrant red of the medium-rare steak began to rot before their very eyes. The color didn't just fade, it turned a deep, bruised violet, then a charcoal gray, and finally, a terrifying, absolute pitch black. The blackness spread like a drop of ink in a glass of water, veins of darkness crawling through the fibers of the meat, turning the masterpiece into something that looked like it had been pulled from a scorched earth. The smell hit them a second later, a pungent, acrid stench of burning rubber and rotten garlic. Hyun-Soo recoiled slightly, his nostrils flaring. The physical proof was undeniable. The plate in Joleen's hands now looked like a piece of cursed obsidian, a charred remains of a meal that would have ended an empire. "That is the phosphorus carbonizing," Joleen whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the destruction she had predicted. "The acid accelerated the oxidation. If that had happened inside you, Mr. Choi, your lungs would have looked exactly like that meat in under 3 minutes." The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer a silence of suspicion, but a silence of profound, heavy realization. The guards looked at the blackened meat and then at Joleen with a mixture of awe and dawning horror. They had been looking for a man with a gun, while she had been fighting a war on a plate. Hyun-Soo looked at the blackened remains, then slowly turned his gaze back to Joleen. For the first time, his expression wasn't cold. It was appreciative. He saw her now, not as a ghost, not as a shadow in a uniform, but as the only person in the room who truly knew how to protect him. "You said you were just a waitress," Hyun-Soo said, his voice barely a whisper. "But you see things my generals miss. You see the world as it is, not as it appears to be." He stood up, the chair scraping back, and for a moment, the most powerful man in the city stood before the girl from the south side as an equal. "The demonstration is over. Now, we find out who gave the chef the lemon." The blackened steak sat on the table like a charred heart, a silent testament to the murder that had been averted. The acrid scent of the chemical reaction still hung in the air, but the chaos of moments ago had been replaced by something far more unsettling, a cold, surgical precision. Choi Hyun-Soo didn't need to shout orders. He didn't need to point fingers. He simply sat back down, and the machinery of his empire began to grind with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a clockwork blade. "Clean the table," Hyun-Soo said. The words were a soft exhale, but they acted as a trigger for a choreographed purge. The enforcers moved with a grace that was no longer defensive, but predatory. The head of security, the man who had nearly taken Joleen's life, signaled to his team with minute gestures, flicks of the wrist and sharp nods that translated into immediate, invisible violence. Two men stepped toward table 4, where a high-ranking associate had been sitting, his face a mask of poorly hidden sweat. They didn't draw their guns. They simply stood behind him, their hands resting on his shoulders in a gesture that looked, to any outsider, like a respectful greeting. But the associate's eyes went wide, his body sagging as he realized the lemon Joleen had mentioned had soured his own fate as well. They lifted him from his seat as if he were made of air and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. Joleen watched, her back against the cool mahogany of the service station, as the room was dismantled and reconstructed in real time. This was the cleaning. It wasn't just about removing the physical evidence of the poison. It was about erasing the lapse in loyalty. Busboys appeared from the periphery, moving in a silent, frantic blur. They didn't look at Joleen, and they certainly didn't look at the blackened meat. They replaced the blood-stained linens where Chef Park had knelt. They polished the floor where his sweat had fallen. They moved with the same, invisible desperation Joleen had once mastered, but now, watching them, she realized how terrifying that invisibility truly was. It allowed the world to continue as if the horrors of the last 10 minutes had never happened. A new bottle of wine was brought out. A fresh set of silver was laid. Within 5 minutes, the VIP lounge looked exactly as it had before the first plate was served. The only difference was the absence of 3 men and the presence of the girl who had seen through the veil. The other guests in the room, the ones who hadn't been implicated, went back to their hushed conversations. They were professionals of the underworld. They knew that the best way to survive a purge was to pretend it was a natural phenomenon, like a passing storm. The clinking of crystal and the low hum of the jazz trio resumed, weaving a tapestry of normalcy over the underlying scent of ozone and betrayal. It was chilling, this business as usual. It suggested that in Hyun-Soo's world, death was just a line item to be reconciled at the end of the night. Hyun-Soo looked at Joleen, who was still standing by the pillar, her hands finally beginning to stop their frantic shaking. He picked up his fresh glass of wine, swirled the dark liquid, and watched the legs of the wine coat the glass. He didn't drink. He was waiting. "The table is clean," he remarked, his voice returning to its steady, melodic baritone. "The traitors are being processed. The air is clear. And yet, the most important seat remains empty." He looked at the chair directly to his right, the one reserved for his most trusted advisor, a seat that had been vacant for months. The head of security returned, his suit jacket straightened, his expression as unreadable as the stone walls. He leaned down and whispered something into Hyun-Soo's ear. The boss nodded once, a sharp, final gesture. The chef, the associate, and the mole in the security detail had been accounted for. The empire was secure again, but it had been hollowed out. Joleen felt the weight of the silence. She had expected to be dismissed, to be sent back to the kitchen to wash the grease from her skin and try to forget the taste of copper in her mouth. But the room didn't let her go. The guards didn't look through her anymore. They looked at her, their eyes filled with a new, guarded respect. She had done the impossible. She had outwatched the watchers. She had proven that the smallest person in the room held the most dangerous power. "Do you know why I keep this room so quiet, Joleen?" Hyun-Soo asked, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because you want to hear the threats before they arrive," she replied, her voice no longer a whisper. Hyun-Soo smiled, a thin, razor-sharp line that didn't reach his eyes. "I kept it quiet, so I could hear the lies. But I think I've been listening for the wrong things. I've been listening for the sound of steel, when I should have been looking for the shimmer in the steam." He set his wine down, untouched, and gestured to the empty space beside him. "The shift is over, Joleen. But your work is just beginning." The transition was so absolute it felt like a shift in the Earth's axis. One moment, Joleen was a girl in a stained apron clutching a blackened plate. The next, she was the silent epicenter of the room. Choi Hyun-Soo rose from his seat, the movement fluid and weighted with a gravity that drew every eye toward him. He didn't approach her like a master approaching a servant. He moved like a predator recognizing another of its kind. He stopped just inches away, his height casting a long, cool shadow over her. "The manager tells me you are one of my most efficient employees," Hyun-Soo began, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her chest. Quiet, punctual, unobtrusive. "He says you are the perfect waitress because you are never heard." He tilted his head, his dark eyes scanning the exhaustion and the lingering spark of defiance on her face. "But he is a fool. You are far too loud to be a waitress, Joleen J, Butler. Every time you look at a room, your mind is screaming the truth of what you see. You don't just clear tables. You dissect them." Joleen felt her throat tighten, not with fear this time, but with the overwhelming weight of being truly seen for the first time in her life. "I just didn't want you to die, Mr. Choi," she whispered. "A noble sentiment," he replied, a faint, cynical edge to his tone. "But nobility didn't save me tonight. Observations did.
Chemistry did."
A girl who was supposed to be a shadow decided to become a sun. He reached out, his hand steady and warm, and gently took the poisoned, blackened plate from her frozen fingers. He handed it to the head of security without looking back, as if passing off a piece of trash. "I have 1,000 men who can pull a trigger. I have hundreds who can drive a car or balance a ledger. But I have no one who can see a war in a grain of salt." He turned back toward the table, his hand resting on the back of the heavy, velvet-lined chair that sat at his right hand, the seat of the advisor, the position of the High Council. It was a seat that carried the power of life and death, a seat that men had murdered to even sit near. "You have spent 3 years watching me from the corners," Hyun-Soo said, his voice dropping to a confidential, lethal intimacy. "Now, you will watch the world for me from the center. I don't want you in the kitchen, and I don't want you carrying a tray. I want your eyes on every glass that is poured, every hand that is shaken, and every plate that is set before me. You will be the filter through which my world passes." He pulled the chair out, the legs whispering against the rug. It was a silent invitation that felt more like a coronation. "From this moment on, no one touches my food but the hands that prepare it and the eyes that vet it. You will be my shadow, my sentinel, and my one true constant. You are the only person in this city allowed to touch my plate." Joleen looked at the chair. It represented everything she had ever been afraid of: the violence, the paranoia, the cold-blooded reality of the underworld. But it also represented the end of her invisibility. No longer would she be the girl the powerful ignored. She would be the reason they stayed powerful. She looked at her hands, still red-streaked from the toxin she had identified, and then she looked at Hyun-Soo. He wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her a throne in a kingdom of shadows. Slowly, with a poise she didn't know she possessed, Joleen stepped forward. She smoothed her apron one last time, a final ghost of her old life, and took her seat. As she sat, the enforcers around the room bowed their heads in a synchronized, terrifying display of deference. The hierarchy had been rewritten in the span of a dinner service. Hyun-Soo sat beside her and signaled for the wine to be poured. This time, as the sommelier approached, he didn't look at the boss for approval. He looked at Joleen. She watched the wine hit the glass, her eyes tracking the viscosity, the color, and the way the bubbles broke on the surface. She gave a single, sharp nod. Only then did Choi Hyun-Soo drink. The waitress was gone. The kingmaker had arrived.